do it in a big circle. It's called Frost Line Circle. Finally, I'm sort of a 10-year guy. I've worked at something for 10 years. I sort of get burned out and I got to go do something else. And this was happening to me in Frost Line as well. So after 10 years, I just thought, you know, the administration would kill you for one thing. Fortunately, I hired a very, very good man as a general manager, so he was dealing with most of the problems, leaving me to work on the product development and the things I like to do. But still, it was just too much administration. So I decided to sell out. I hired a man with Veteran Company in Denver to find the companies and do the negotiations, because I feel if you can do them with sort of like Kissinger used to do, a subtle diplomacy going back and forth and leave you out of the middle of it, you end up far better. And that really worked out. I was wooed by Greyhound Bus Company, Southland Life Insurance Company, a kit company that it was a craft company whose name I can no longer remember, and the Gillette Corporation. And the reason all of these oddball companies were after me, not just me, but other companies as well, is that in those days it became very popular to diversify your business. Because if you owned a number of unrelated businesses and your core business was going south, the thought was that all these other businesses would keep the profits up and support you. So, and another thing, at the same time, the best business going seemed to be the mail order business. LL Bean had really shown the way. They had gone from this little outfit doing nothing out there till suddenly they went into the mail order business and just went off like a skyrocket. Everybody took notice. So I was primarily in the mail order business, although over the 10 years that I had the company, I had also opened 18 stores, stretched from Boston to Anchorage to San Jose and every place in between. So I became sought after. I mean, not me, but Frostline, because I was in the mail order business, and it was a very profitable company. And ultimately, the Gillette Corporation made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I went laughing all the way to the bank. And I've managed to stay unemployed ever since. That's about it.
I should mention, for those of you who don't know, Dale lives here in Boulder. Ingvar Soto, who also lives here in Boulder.
For a long time.
Long time. Mean cross-country skier.
By 1965, I lived in Boulder for 3 winters. And the touring skis I brought with me from Norway 3 years earlier, they were pretty much shot. And that was a serious situation. And it was about the time when also I was supposed to go back home, but there were a lot of things to do here also, so I decided to try to make an effort to get new skis instead of going back myself. And I talked to a company in Trondheim, where I came from, if they could send me some skis. It became clear that sending a couple pair of skis was impractical by air freight, because the freight was so expensive. But if I could get a few more pairs to come in and help pay for the shipment, then it will be fine. So I went to talk to some friends who were already touring skiing, and I thought I had about half a dozen people who would go in on this first order. And I stenciled up some order forms with name, height and weight and shoe size and all of that, and gave it out. A couple of weeks later, I got about 75 of those left. So that I got them back. I sent out about half a dozen. So there was a great interest in ski touring equipment at the time. So that order went out and came back. But of course, not everything fit the first time. So there was a question of, what are you sending in the next order? And The next order went in the first year in '65. I think about 125 sets of touring skis and equipment, boots and bindings and poles and everything, plus some assorted waxes and things to go with it. So that was kind of fun. Next year, sort of repeated the same thing. And with all these skis here, it became also necessary to have some instructions on how to use the equipment. And the ski touring school at CMC got started. And I was running that for several years. I remember Dave Robertson, he was part of that, and he was the safety guy. He showed pictures of this mine tailings from, where was it from?
Oh, it was 70 miles south of St. Louis where that caught an avalanche.
That's right. So he could talk about avalanches. I knew nothing about avalanches, but I talked about equipment. It started out sort of modestly too. I remember we started, the format was, I think it's the same today, that we had a couple of lectures early in the, or late in the fall, and talked about equipment and technique and all of that, and avalanches as well. And then we got instructors to take people up to East Portal, Lake Dora, wherever we could find snow and some suitable terrain. So it was a question now, where do you find instructors? Well, it turned out that there were a lot of Norwegian engineering students at CU, and none of them had any experience in teaching skiing necessarily. But they had the right accent, so it worked. So the ski school went out and it grew over the years. We started out with the lectures at the conference room, I remember. And then we kind of outgrew that, and we moved down to the National Bureau of Standards auditorium. And I think it was a couple of hundred anyway, one year. So the interest really grew fast for cross-country skiing or ski touring. That also came other interests associated with that, like where do you go? There were no trails up in the mountains. We were just bushwhacking pretty much wherever we could. So from within the CNC, there was a core group with many of us who are here tonight who worked on laying out trails, like the CMC trail, as we call it today, up the Grand Lake. We had a CMC cabin, which was became a goal, and we laid out the North Trail, and other trails came later. And then we also, in '69, we got together and built the hut up at Wind Mountain, which we named Boulder, which is a Norwegian name for a square building with a fire pit in the middle. So all of this sort of came along with the interest in ski touring. Well, the business end of it, it was rather untenable to have all of this going through our house. There were poles and bindings and waxes and pieces of bindings everywhere. In the kitchen, living room, and under the beds in the bedroom. So it was kind of overflowing. So I decided that although I was not really sort of planning to be in this kind of business, I started a business called it Norsk. Norsk, that means Norwegian in Norway. And then we moved had to find a place to do this. This was just a winter business, nothing in the summer. And who could have a low business in the winter would be people like bicycle stores and such. So I contacted Spoke, and they had a store up on the hill, and they had also a store in Denver. Yeah, we moved in there and set up our shop during the winter months. And it also grew into a wholesale business, because there were other stores up and around the Front Range that were looking for cross-country skis. And I had a Volvo station wagon, and Otto, her daughter, is sitting on it. He became the salesman, and he was running up and down the front range and selling cross-country equipment to stores from New Mexico to Montana. So that worked pretty well for a while. This was a side business for me. My main occupation was a bioengineer scientist at CU, working at a medical school. So I kind of sort of had all of this on the side, which got to be quite a bit of work for a while. And I wasn't about to quit the university either. And we floated around with Spoke for a while, and then we ended up at Frostline when they were down on 30th Street, and we had a quarter over there during the winter time selling ski equipment. And Stan, who was Dale's store manager, he was a fabulous businessman for us to run this store. We were all amateurs in this, so that was a good infusion. Then in the early 70s, there was a major shift in the world economics. And before then, the exchange rates between countries were kind of fixed, like the Norwegian kroner, which was needed to buy equipment in Norway, was always a fixed rate. It was 7 kroner and 14 øre for a dollar. That was stable. So we could go and put some orders in the spring, and it would be the same in the fall. I think it was 73, all this changed when currency started to float. And that got to be a little complicated for an amateur businessman like myself, and it wasn't that much fun anymore. But by that also, there were a lot of other large corporations who were in the ski business, downhill ski business, discovered that there was a business there in ski touring equipment and cross-country skiing. So they came in, and the whole market kind of changed. And then at that time, Gary Neptune came to our rescue, and he bought the inventory and the whole shooting match, and he got into ski touring. So that's the story I had to tell for how the ski touring really started up in full force. There were ski tours here before I came here, but there wasn't really a sport so much. So it's been fun. It's been a fun ride over these years, and I'm glad I didn't go back to Norway then. I enjoyed it here. So the other thing that came along with that was that when Gary took over, we got involved with a lot of other things, and Gary got into the ski touring business, and he can tell us about that one. Thank you.
Gary Neptune.
Well, I kind of got in on the tail end of all of these other guys, and over the years, I've owned probably many of the products. I bought something from everyone here, and used the products and sold many of the products and that kind of thing. Boy, where do I start? I think I'll start about 1964. A good friend of mine and we'd been saving our summer money, and we were going to go to the Alps and hitchhike around, and our parents supported us. Thought this would be a really educational thing to do. My buddy actually had relatives in Colorado, and his dad had been a climber, so he had other ideas a little beyond what my parents had, and I didn't say anything about that. But he said, first of all, you've got to have a sleeping bag. So go to Hollybar, write to them. Here's the Colorado Mountain Club thing. You can get their address, and I bought a Hollybar Teton sleeping bag for that trip. That was 1964 it was. And a few other various products. And we went over there, and he knew that there was going to be a Colorado Mountain Club outing. Dale Johnson was the leader, so we met there. And after that trip, well, actually, and one other kind of a key thing there, and I didn't fully realize it at the time, when the Colorado Mountain Club part of the trip that we linked onto was finished, we stashed our stuff in Geneva and hitchhiked up to Norway and all around there. And that's where I saw my first cross-country skis and heard these stories about what cross-country skiers did across these mountains. And that was far more romantic than just downhill skiing, at least in my mind. And I'd had this taste of the Alps and all of these images and everything was going on in my head. So my blood was boiling, basically. Went back to graduate school and was a geologist. And I had, during graduate school, I did enough of that kind of work to realize that this is not going to be my life. So I finally dropped out, packed it up, and moved to Boulder. And at that time, I was very fortunate. These guys started all this stuff. And now I had a place I could go that actually had opportunities. And maybe I could actually get a job working for somebody, because the industry and the whole outdoors was so small at that time that I didn't see much of a future there other than something like that. So I was very fortunate to move here, and I got a job working for Jim. And it was a wonderful place, and I was, they were quite open. I learned a lot. I was soaked up in every little part of the business that I could. And then I made a kind of a bizarre decision, and I've sort of operated that way ever since. Somehow at that point I thought, well, I was a climber, thought now I've got to make a living off the poorest people in the world. So I started running a store. And during the course of all of that, of course, as Ingvar said, cross-country skiing boomed. And I always sold skis, but on a very small scale. And then when he made it easy for me, he was a smart one. He really helped out and made it easy for me to buy his inventory and so on. He was generous with it. And so I bought that, and I was really in the ski business, right when it was just tanking. Bill Forrest knows, he sells snowshoes now, like we used to sell skis. So the cross-country business has gone down. And then Ingvar was talking about the exchange rates, and the dollar just keeps getting worse and worse. And I buy Norwegian skis and Norwegian crowns. So the price is going up $50 to $100 a pair just from last winter to this winter. This is the kind of business I'm in and the choices I've made. And it's 35 years later. And the thing is, I still like it. I like the customers. I like the people I work with. I like the people in the industry. And so I still do it. And so that's really me in a nutshell, my story in a nutshell. And that's great to see all these guys here together.
Now I just want to move to some conversation amongst the people up here, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience. And I just want to start off a story about Gary. It's 1972. Don Nelson and I and Gary are selling whatever at Hollybar. We always had a Saturday morning sales meeting, which started like an hour before the store opened. John Whitbeck would bring 10 gallons of coffee and 400 donuts, and we'd eat all that crap, and we'd be wired. And in the back of the store where the boots were sold, there was a big stone wall, kind of a triangle space with shelves on it where the boots sat, and there were pitons in the concrete. And there was a hammock on the wall up there that was to be sold. And Whitbeck seemed to disappear about 9:30 when the store opened. And Gary would climb up in that hammock, deadly silent, and some man, lady would come up and look at the boot, and Gary would go, boot! Scare the crap out of him. Next.
I've got a little story about cross-country ski to start. When John was at Gary's, this was in the early 60s, he had on the wall, I think, one pair of Bona skis on the wall. And I haggled with him for a year and a half until we sold them to me for $30. And I think the year after that was when Ingvar started to import them.
High price.
Yeah, I thought, well, I was generous. I had mine.
One thing that I'd say is that the number of people here on the stage, you can trace the industry back as Penny has said, you can trace the industry back to that many people. I mean, Jerry Cunningham being among the very first, Dick Kelty, and it seemed to settle in Boulder and in Berkeley. Those were the two areas. Berkeley had North Face, Ski Hut, and Sierra Designs, and Boulder was the other hotbed. Then Eastern Mountain Sports, of course, opened in Boston. One other thing I was going to say, names that kind of household names today, there was kind of an itinerant blacksmith in Ventura, California by the name of Yvon Chenard. We always used, he made pitons. And those of you who know Patagonia today, which is slightly larger than General Motors, I think, we always said that if the surf was no good, you would get your delivery of pitons. But if the surf was up, all of those guys were surfing and nobody got deliveries of anything. The other one was Royal Robbins. If you know that name, you see equipment around. And Royal was importing a few boots in the business. But the concept of going back to a very handful of people.
I remember when I was in the mountain calling the training command, on Thursday and Friday we'd go to the supply room and we'd always load up with angle pitons, wafer pitons, and different kinds of pitons, and then we'd take off and come to Boulder on the weekend. And our first stop was at Hollybar. And we sold those pitons to Roy Hollybar. And that's where he got a good supply of his pitons. And then we'd get enough money, and we'd head for Estes Park, and we'd go to the Dark Horse, and we'd drink until they closed it, and then we'd head up to Longs Peak Trailhead, and we'd hike up to the Chasm Lake Shelter Cabin, and then get up and climb all weekend, come back into Estes Park on Sunday night and repeat the drinking at the Dark Horse until it closed, and then go back to Fort Carson. So we were an unofficial supplier to Hollybar Mountaineering.
I think one of the things that, just kind of a bit of perspective, you know, we're talking about all these manufacturers. You know, it's not as if nobody ever went out into the wilderness before that, but it tended to be a very macho, you know, father-son, Boy Scout. It was still a very conquer the wilderness kind of thing. And I know when Dad went into the 10th Mountain Division, he thought, oh man, this is going to be so cool. I'm going to have all the latest equipment. And then he got there and saw what they had to deal with, and that, you know, his mind was already, he'd been inventing since he was in high school, but now his mind really went to work. But there were, of course, because of the two wars, there were a lot of developments in materials. In particular, nylon was a big improvement. When Dad bought his first nylon, it was actually football jersey material. And because of that, one of his big, now he and Mother started out as climbers. They had some first descents up in Canada. They had a big plan to go try one of the biggies in the Himalayas in something other than a big 200 Sherpas following along with hundreds and thousands of pounds of material. They were talking about lightweight, you know, going with a very small, compact run up, run down, which resonates very well with a lot of people today, but was completely foreign then. They never made that trip, but what really came out of it was one of the big emphasis. When I was in junior high, I went to a lot of the conventions and outdoor retailers things with my parents because my brothers were gone. And they didn't know what to do with me, so I went along. And so I really saw and heard Dad talk about the change that made backpacking a family thing. That you didn't have to be big and macho. I mean, we went, and his big thing was he would carry 20 pounds, and Mother and I would carry, we were supposed to carry 10, but I always had a couple of books along because I was almost finished with one, so mine usually got up closer to 15 pounds. But it was very lightweight. And it was very hard for me because none of my friends, you know, now in Boulder, hey, if I were in middle school in Boulder now, I had lots of friends who were into the outdoors and backpacking. But I remember that was a very hard thing that none of my friends were into it. And when we take them with us, you know, I remember one sprained her ankle up by Blue Lake. It was just never very successful. And I was so jealous of my twin brothers who could go do stuff with each other. But I think that's one of the big things that all these people contributed to was the change from just even though we are all except me up here are men, but it was a real change in the way of looking at the, everybody could get out into the wilderness, and that's one of the reasons we've managed to preserve so much wilderness now. If it were still just the realm of the mountaineers, I'm not sure we would, but ski touring is a big thing. It's very good. You don't have to be rich to go ski touring the way you do to go downhill skiing and so on. So I think there's a lot of really wonderful things, and I'm jealous. I wish I could grow up all over again in Boulder now.
I have a footnote to John Humbug's adventure in the kit business. I'd like to say that John has the highest integrity of anybody I know, because when he was starting Ultra, before he let it be known to anybody else, he visited me at Frostline, came to my office, and he told me, man to man, that he was going to go into competition with me. And I really appreciated the honesty of that. It was wonderful. But indirectly, I contributed to the demise of his company, too. Because I sold Frostline, and over the next 4 years, Gillette, bringing in professional managers, turned an extremely profitable company into a money-losing company. No matter what they did, they lost money. It was just fantastic. I couldn't believe it. And finally, they decided that maybe they'd made a mistake, and they thought we could just sell this company and start over. So after having lost money for 4 or 5 years, they found that nobody wanted to buy it. And they came and asked me if I'd like to buy it back. They gave me a heck of a deal. I said, no thanks, and then they've done that. Ultimately, they decided to liquidate the company. They started selling it off bit by bit. They put all of that, they just flooded the market with the kits, which practically brought John's business to a standstill. And I would say that it contributed to the demise of Ultra.
Just as a follow-up to that, two things. One, that really was tough, and I wanted to go and buy all his inventory. When Gillette decided to sell off all the kits that they had in inventory, I went to my board of directors and said, look, this is a tremendous opportunity. Holybar had decided they shut down their kit business, and Frostline was there, but they had a lot of inventory, and I said, if we could just buy this, we could corner this market. And at the time, interest rates were escalating. I had some very nice and good investors, but they said, I just don't think we're going to do that. And we took a pass. We were highly leveraged at the bank at the time, and one of the things that we were doing was paying 3 over prime. And if you think back to the Jimmy Carter years, prime went to 21%. And you think about what that does to your bottom line. So we didn't have the cash to be able to go and buy that inventory from Frostline, and I had always hoped that we could have done that. One other thing I'd like to add is that it's amazing to me the way this industry has spread, and you never know which way it's going to go. I mean, Yvon Chouinard is probably the greatest example of taking one thing and then expanding it out into a huge business. But I'd like to come back to Jerry Cunningham, who developed the first back carrier and gave it to Meg Hansen and said, Meg, go ahead and run with this. I've got my other business over here. You go ahead and take that product. Well, she built a very nice, profitable business that had money at the bottom line, and the conglomerate that I worked for that bought Alpine Designs decided they needed to have a good quarter because they were public. And they figured out that if they could buy Meg Hansen's company, it would add an extra penny to their earnings, and Wall Street would really get excited about that. So they went out and made a big push, and they went to Meg, made her an offer that she couldn't refuse, and then started to look around because she said, you know, I'd love to have some outside help in building this. And the corporate headquarters came to me and they said, do you know anybody that would help as a sales manager? And I had a friend, a fellow who took my job back in New York by the name of Chuck Wilkie. And I said, sure, this is a great guy. He's a very smart business person. He could come in and help Meg. And Chuck Wilkie came in and worked with Meg, and over time, she handed off the business to him. Now, it was just a small little couple $1 million business when she sold it. But by the time Chuck Wilkie left that business, it had become Jericho, and it had expanded into other things. It was a $100 million business that all emanated from a back carrier that Jerry Cunningham had developed and said, here, Meg, you take it and you run it. I think it's fascinating the way those things tend to evolve.
A comment I'd make as far as the innovators, the Jerry Cunninghams and the George Lambs and the Dale Johnsons, is that it was about the late 70s when somebody discovered that you could take a product over to China and that they could make it and bring it back over here, and it cost a lot less money than if you went out and hired people. And I think it takes innovators to start that homegrown business to bring something back here, to have something in the U.S. that can be made here and start in the basement or the garage or what have you. Because you can, in fact, if you have an idea for a product, you can take it over and for a minimum amount of X number, 100 units or 1,000 units, they will make it in any color and shape and ship it over here.
Anything else? Ingvar.
I'd like to make a comment about the ski touring, that next year it will be 40 years since the Boulder hut was built. And I don't know how many of you go to that hut and enjoy it, but it's still there and it's being maintained and it's in good shape. So maybe next year sometime it would be time to gather up all your old skis and boating, like we did a few years back, and ski up to Green Mountain. Autumn. Another job for celebration.
Okay.
Another similar announcement, we've been quite involved in the new Bradford Washburn American Mountaineering Museum. This is a joint project of American Alpine Club and the Colorado Mountain Club with some input from National Geographic. Very professional museum. It's in the American Mountaineering Center, which is the headquarters of both the CMC and the AAC in Boulder. And I heartily recommend for those of you who have not seen it to go see it and give us money.
Well, one comment on the museum aspect is that we have a second museum right here in Boulder. And so you should visit both Neptune Mountaineering and the American Alpine Club.
Questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to ask all the panelists, anyone can answer, you don't all have to, but what the oldest piece of equipment that you're still using, and then two, have you seen effects of climate change on glaciers or couloirs or ice climbing?
I'll take a shot at the last part of your question. First time I went to climbed in the Alps was in 1953. The north face of Matterhorn, for example, was total sheet ice. My son climbed it in about 66, maybe, and it was all an ice climb, totally. I was there 2 years ago, and there was no ice on it at all.
I'd like to take a shot at the other half of the question. So I don't know if any of you have ever been to the brand new cabin. Anybody here ever been to the brand new cabin? Okay, so the cabin was built in 28, and these people don't have responsibility for that. But the trails that you ski on, if you ski to the cabin, were very much the product of Ingvar's efforts, and they're still being maintained by Dave and Peter and other people. The Gold Spittoon race, which I believe Gary originated, or won every time, I don't know which it was, had to be retired because of liability problems, but this was a race around Long Lake, I believe. And I was just there the other day working up in the cabin, and I cleaned off all the sleeping pads. They're these beautiful sleeping pads, which of course were put together and given to the cabin by Frostline. So, if you've been to the cabin, one of the oldest things that may still be in use is those marvelous sleeping pads that Dale put together, of course. Thank you.
I can answer some of that old equipment. We just used this week an old Holyobar pack, the teardrop pack. I think maybe George saw it, I don't know. My father-in-law had, but it needs a zipper fix to it. The second thing I should point out, just a couple of weeks ago, our 26-year-old granddaughter, as a climber, came down from Fairbanks, and I loaned her a bunch of my climbing equipment, and you never saw a nose turn up so fast. So I thought it was pretty new, hot stuff, but she tells me it's 40 years out of date.
Well, I bought my first rock climbing shoes from Hollywood, and crawled off of pleather shoes, which a lot of you guys remember. And I like them, and I bought more, and I still climb them. And I resold my own shoes myself. I just hand sold them now, and I kind of enjoy doing that. And I also bought a Bergen's backpack, the Ingvar skiing it from REI, I think in 1967. Because it had the way the frame had a little extra platform at the bottom. Carried rocks really well when I was a geologist. But I still use that. You see it in the office and you see it on the ski trails.
Gary, didn't you do, weren't you in the boot repair business?
Yeah, I did some of that, yeah. And I still have one of the machines and still like fixing the machines. And in fact, when I don't have this year, but when I did that second winter ascent of the Diamond in '73, I took a Hollybar down jacket and half bag, and for backup, I had my Frostline down jacket that I'd sewed up in the late '60s. That must have been one of your first things. So kind of for backup in case it was cold, which it was.
So you don't have access to any more contemporary equipment, Gary?
No,
Is that-
I can't seem to find anything. Go ahead.
Along the lines of Dave's comment, I have a question for Jim. I brought my Hollybar 7-foot custom ultimate. We got a little problem with it.
I would say, you know,
Warranty.
the warranty expired. I hate to tell you that. Last month, who does repair? Seriously, who does repair?
Oh, there's a guy out on 47th, right by the old Boulder Outdoor Center, and he does repairs. He does a good job.
Jim Clements, is that?
Yeah.
We did. Hollybar used to repair any branded product. And true story, a gentleman in Denver by the name of Governor Lamb, first name was Dick Lamb. Dick Lamb sent us an Elk Sport jacket to repair, and somehow we had the wrong zipper, a different zipper, and we went through hell. And that was the last non-Hollybar product that we repaired. We're not going to go through this one again.
Should have gone next door, take the zipper.
Maybe you can get extended.
Go ahead.
When you mentioned the custom bag, Hollybar did a lot of it, as you said, as far as Alice. And Alice, I said, was a lady who was incredible. She died when she was 57. She died in November of 68. And she didn't turn down an order for, I mean, if they, a 7 foot this or a 5, and she was great as far as, for those of you who, it's called grading patterns. When you come up with a jacket and you want to make it small and medium, large, and extra large, how to keep growing. And Alice was great because she'd put it on one, she'd say, that's a medium. And so those were the dimensions. And she put one on, this is going to be large. So she tested them all, and she was a wonderful, wonderful lady. When I found a production manager who was a cut and sew guy from Denver, I took him up for his interview with Alice because I knew she'd want to approve it. And she handed him a mountain, we went to their home, and she handed him a mountain parka. She said, tell me how that went together. And he looked at it, and I thought, oh, this is the test. I mean, he better get it right or he's going to flunk. And he went through it. He said, I think you folded this, and then you tacked that, and then and he walked through the steps of the production. She smiled, and she said, yes. And I thought he passed. And he turned out to be a wonderful, wonderful person.
I have 2 more Alice stories. And when I was working there, one of the things they did was they would go to the waltz night in Denver, where the Denver Symphony played, and once a month. And that summer, it was after lunch. She said, "Well, we're going to the waltz night tonight," and so she unrolled a bunch of orange ripstop nylon, no pattern, made herself an evening gown in time to leave for Denver at 6. It looked very good. The second one I remember is she made us a double sleeping bag when Janet and I got married in 1956. And I went over doing some measuring, and she was filling that with down by putting loose down in the bathtub in the front room and running a vacuum cleaner backwards. And it's a damn good sleeping bag.
I'd just like to thank you all personally for what you have done for the community, particularly for women and children. Back in 1977, I was involved in developing a nonprofit organization that did wilderness trips for women and children. And we got donations of backpacks from Hollybar, jackets from Camp 7. A lot of you just helped us turn a lot of young kids onto the wilderness. And this morning I left a group of 50+ age-wise women who were doing a trip over Arapahoe Pass, and they were taking Camp 7 jackets with a lot of duct tape that we got back in the 70s. So thank you all for what you've done.
One thing I'd say is we're having a little reunion tomorrow of former Hollybar employees. That's how this all started, was me running into Scott Cookrell in Fiji, of all places, last October. And he said, you know, we should have a get-together. And tomorrow we'll have, what, 70 people? Around 70. Around 70 people, former employees of Hollybar, get together for a breakfast.
I'd like to extend a thank you again to everybody, and to speak particularly to Gary, because I don't know if everybody realizes that a lot of the Boulder Nordic Club and a lot of the cross-country skiing that is continuing now as a result of when Eldora fell apart. I can't remember what year it was. And Gary really helped start the Boulder Nordic Club and had a lot of people who helped volunteer, but really for, I think it was it 1 season or 2, kind of ran it through the shop there. Just had people, paid the people who work there, as I did, to help run that
Well, maybe we should wrap this up. We need to be, there's some displays over here on the left side of the building. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and thank all of you.